Grazie. Grazie, possiamo iniziare. Io saluto e ringrazio i rappresentanti del governo e tutte le autorità di ogni tipo che sono qui presenti, i colleghi che sono intervenuti. Ci fa molto piacere vedere che insomma, le lezioni della Sala Zuccari sono così seguite e acquistano anche un seguito internazionale. Cominciamo ad avere già prenotazioni dall'estero. Voi sapete che questa è la seconda lecture dopo quella del 21 gennaio del nostro collega senatore Agnelli. La terza lecture dopo questa sarà tenuta dal Presidente della Repubblica Ceca Václav Havel e sarà il 4 di aprile. Seguiranno in una data che è ancora da destinarsi, ma per le quali comunque abbiamo già una conferma, lezioni del Presidente Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, attualmente impegnato nella Convenzione europea, e anche del Presidente del Brasile Cardoso, che ci onorerà egli pure della sua presenza. Il tema è lo stesso di tutto quanto il ciclo, può essere svolto in modi diversi, ma il tema sono i problemi della globalizzazione, gli aspetti politici anche dei problemi della globalizzazione. La nostra intenzione è la stessa, cioè dibattere questa questione, le questioni connesse senza schematismi, senza demonizzazioni, senza neanche entusiasmi infondati, ma in una maniera più pacata, razionale o ragionevole possibile. Anche la qualità dei nostri relatori è ugualmente la stessa, perché è molto elevata. È inutile che io spenda parole oggi qui di fronte a voi per presentare il dottor Henry Kissinger, che è già segretario di Stato, assistente per la sicurezza nazionale del Presidente degli Stati Uniti, premio Nobel per la pace e autore di libri, di pubblicazioni e di analisi sulla situazione politica internazionale che sono tra le più apprezzate e comunque tra le più seguite. E perciò io vi ringrazio tutti quanti. Prima di dare la parola al nostro relatore, let me say just a few words in a language which rather optimistically I would say I take as English. I thank you very much, Mr. Kissinger, for accepting our invitation, for being here, and for delivering your speech. I know that you don't have a complete written text, but we'll do our best to have it soon and to hand it out, both in English and Italian translation. And I would like to say that I'm personally very particularly glad to have you here because I am an admirer of your books and papers and analysis about the different problems of the international situation. If I'm not wrong, and if I am, please correct me, the overriding idea or the underlying idea in your views about foreign policy is twofold or maybe threefold. First, that peace is a goal for which we should make any effort, any possible effort. Second, that our desire or love for peace is not the same as pacifism. Peace costs, and sometimes it costs a lot. And thirdly, that in order to keep peace, we have to establish or to fix a system of international rules. If I'm not wrong, sometimes you have mentioned something like the situation in Europe before 1914. But of course here, a set of problems crops up, especially in connection with or related to the topic of your conversation, that is globalization. The problems are, for example, how can we govern the process for peace in a world which is more and more globalized, and sometimes in a world which presents very strong divisions. And which rules may we adopt? And how and where may we fix such rules? But of course, I'm not supposed to give a lecture myself, so I stop here, and I thank you very much for being with us, and I give you the floor. Thank you again.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure for me to be here among so many friends of several decades now. There in this room people with whom I've worked and people with whom I've argued, but always in the spirit that we were, in terms of values, on essentially the same side. So when I'm in Italy, obviously I'm in a country of a radically different history, a longer history, but one whose fundamental values parallel most of the concerns for which America stands. Now, first of all, for the sake of the emotional stability of the American ambassador and DCM, who have done me the honor of coming, I must make one fundamental point. I do not necessarily represent the administration. The administration is headed by a group of people who are personal friends, with whom I substantially agree, but obviously the official policy of the United States will be pronounced by the designated representatives. And I say this only so that the embassy does not have to put out a statement tomorrow emphasizing this point. I first came to Italy in 1946. I was a soldier in the American Army of Occupation in Germany. And of course, when one lives in a country, one is always aware of many of the problems and the difficulties. But if anyone had predicted to me in 1946 what Italy looks like today, I would have considered that a fantasy. So what has been achieved materially and politically is an enormous tribute to the tenacity and dedication of the Italian people and of the Italian leadership, which looks very changeable to the United States, but which, if one has dealt with it, has probably more continuity than our government, where every decade we tend to uproot some trees to see whether the roots are still there. So I have now lived so long that I have seen these tremendous changes in Italy, the creation of NATO, and the emergence of the European Union. Nobody thought it possible when all of this started that the Soviet Union would disintegrate, and that so many of our foreign policy problems today are the problems caused by our successes and by our achievements, and successes at which we worked together. Many of the debates of the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s are very hard to remember today. And I like to believe that 10, 20 years from now, many of the disputes of which we are aware today will also be seen in such a perspective. Now, I'll talk to you, the topic that has been written down is globalization and its problems, and I will come to globalization. But I'd like to make some comments about the structure of the international system, the nature of American foreign policy, and the problems that have arisen now as a result of the achievements of the objectives with which we started. When I was a young professor, a graduate student, I called on President Truman, who had just left office. And I asked him what he had done, of which he was most proud. And he said, I'm most proud of the fact that we totally defeated our enemies. And then we brought them back to the community of nations as equals. And I would like to think that only Americans would have done this. Now, I'm not saying only Americans would have done it, but it is a fact that the United States, at a moment of tremendous material superiority, concentrated on building an international system which, in the minds of its leaders, was based on the principle of equality of all the states and on the principle of consultation. And it is important to keep that in mind when one reads the current debate about American unilateralism, multilateralism, as against multilateralism, of which there's such frequent reference. In this country, every city is aware of the temporariness of human construction. Every region has at one time or another seen a foreign occupation. And there is a perspective that goes back for millennia. The United States obviously has been built by immigrants. It has felt secure behind two great oceans. It has never had a powerful neighbor. And it is the only major country in the world that could believe that whether it conducts foreign policy or not is entirely up to its own decision. Every major American program in the post-war period has been presented to the American people as having a limited time frame. Every program has been offered with the proposition that after some period of time, America would be able to get rid of whatever the task was. Even as late as the American intervention in Bosnia, together with NATO, President Clinton presented it to the American Congress as a one-year project. No European or no Italian could possibly believe that the problems of Bosnia, that have a history of hundreds of years, could be solved in 1 year. But the attitude that problems were soluble within a specific time frame, that crises were caused by temporary interruptions of some beneficent status quo, has been a fundamental American conviction, which I, to this day, encounter when I travel around the United States to give speeches. There is therefore in the American history an ambivalence between missionary tendencies and isolationism, both of them existing side by side. And this nation has suddenly been propelled into global leadership. It is true that the United States is now more powerful than any other nation. It is true that there is no other nation that can compete militarily with the United States. But whatever intellectuals may say, the majority of Americans do not particularly gloat in this and do not think that this entitles us to impose our preference all over the world. The majority of Americans probably think it is an opportunity to keep the problems of other parts of the world away from the United States. Now, it is in this context that you have to understand the impact of September 11th on the United States. Nobody had ever thought it possible that the United States could be directly attacked. Even less did anyone think it possible that America would be attacked by enemies we didn't know we had. The vast majority of Americans did not think that Islam was capable of attacking the United States or even thinking of attacking the United States. The difference between this crisis and the Cold War was, in the Cold War there was an enemy. And one could calculate what the enemy would do, rightly or wrongly, and one could assume that the enemy would make its own calculation and that therefore at some point a certain balance could be achieved. But in this crisis, the purpose of the enemy is to inflict suffering. He achieves his objective by producing chaos. He doesn't mind to be killed in the process of doing it. And so it is a challenge that is unprecedented in the American experience, probably to that extent even in the European experience. And therefore one has to understand what America is trying to do right now. When America is challenged, for the reasons that I gave, a country of immigrants that had turned its back on Europe sustained itself by the belief in the superiority of the values that had brought them there. And it therefore is never a purely practical question. It becomes a moral question. So the reaction of the American public and of the American leadership has been to try to overcome this danger, not as one practical solution, but to eradicate it by its roots. By now, I think there is very little disagreement about the first phase of what has been done. The first phase that is in the process of being completed attempts to separate the terrorist groups from the state support that generated them, or that makes them possible. This country has had its own experience with terrorism. And so you have experienced that terrorist groups need some sort of central organization to carry out a systematic campaign. And the attempt of the first phase of American policy has been to separate these terrorist groups from state support. And it has been enormously gratifying to know that in this phase, we have had tremendous support in Europe, and we have greatly appreciated the contribution that Italy has made to this enterprise. And the presence of Italian forces, so far from the historic concerns of Italian foreign policy, is something that means a great deal to all of us. But now the question is, how does one sustain this effort? And I'm not here to advocate any particular policy. I am trying to explain, before I go to more general topics, what is in the minds of people when you read about Iraq or axis of evil or whatever the phrases are that are now in controversy. The fundamental question that is being raised is this. We have learned that weapons can suddenly be used against any of us. And from a technical point of view, Europe is more vulnerable than the United States. What does one do about countries that are developing weapons that we know have weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical, and others? Countries that have no democratic balance to restrain their governments. Countries that have used some of these weapons both against their own people and against their neighbors. Can one wait until they use them? Or can one find some means to prevent this? Our governments are going to be discussing the details of such issues. But the philosophical question and the conceptual question cannot be ignored. One cannot simply say, we will wait until something is done. Most of you do not know, I'm sure, that in 1969, the United States unilaterally renounced the use of biological weapons and announced that it would not use them even in retaliation. I was in the government at the time and one of those who made the decision. And we made that decision, I'd like to think partly on moral grounds, but partly on the grounds that we felt nobody had a right to create a global epidemic which we had no idea how to bring under control. But it was also clear that if biological or chemical weapons would be used against us, we would have to use other weapons of mass destruction in retaliation. So when you sometimes read speculations of what we might do, as you did in recent weeks, you have to look at the history of this. That if these weapons were used against us, that we have to have a nuclear arsenal that is capable of responding. This is in reference to the nuclear debate you've been reading about in recent weeks. But on the question of Iraq, our concern, the question that we raise is, how do you prevent these stockpiles from accumulating and being used at a moment at which a huge catastrophe can be inflicted? People who reject the military means then have to put forward some concrete concept of the alternative. And frankly, this alternative should not simply be some nice diplomatic device, but it should be specific enough and concrete enough to answer the question. Nobody can possibly want a war that is unnecessary. And nobody can want a war without our allies that can simply be dismissed by saying unilateralism as against multilateralism. Because when one has asked an important question, one cannot give a veto on a matter of life and death to everybody. One should also respect their views in coming to decisions. Now, this is the immediate situation. But there is a deeper problem that we all face. I'm of the generation that grew up with Atlantic relations as the central concern of American foreign policy. Some people say this is because I was born in Europe, but my experience in Europe before I emigrated was not so exalted that it tied me to Europe. What tied me to Europe was what I saw as an American soldier during the war, and what I saw in the reconstruction of countries like this, and of the partnership that we all were so proud of in those decades. So for my generation, with all the quarrels we may have had over all these years, we all knew we had a common destiny. And this was instinctive in all the presidents of the United States and in their secretaries of state. But now things have changed internally on both sides of the Atlantic. The generation that is coming into power on both sides of the Atlantic does not have the experience of the common war or of the common period of construction. I was teaching at some public school in New York a few months ago, and I said something about the Berlin crisis. And those were 15-year-old students. They'd never heard of a Berlin crisis. So a lot of other things they hadn't heard of. So they hadn't heard of a lot of things in America either. In fact, they didn't know exactly who I was, but they knew I was famous, but they didn't know exactly for what. So there is, for the generation from the Middle West and Southwest, you cannot count on the fact that they have spent their vacations in Europe, that they have a lot of friends, that when I see something about Italy that confuses me, I call up Gianni, Agnelli, or 2 or 3 others less close to me, but still, that relationship no longer exists. But it doesn't really exist on the European side either. And so a totally new situation has evolved on both sides of the Atlantic, of a new generation coming into office. Moreover, that new generation grows up in a domestic politics in which the process of getting into office is so exhausting and so time-consuming that it does not permit the sort of concentration on substance that was the case in generations that grew up in more leisurely period. So whatever happens in the Middle East or elsewhere, we would have to rethink our relationship. In the period in which I formed my ideas and was in office, the European leaders were all brought up in a time when Europe still conducted major foreign policies, even though by then the European power had diminished. But now The concern on both sides of the Atlantic is importantly with domestic politics. We had 3 presidential elections in a row in which foreign policy was not mentioned at all as a significant issue. And in Europe, the agenda that preoccupies Europeans is European unification. European unification is an interesting subject for Americans, but all the esoteric debates about expansion, broadening versus deepening, and democratic control of bureaucratic foreign policy, it's almost totally unknown to the American public. So that the priorities of the leaders on both sides are not automatically what they used to be. And therefore, the relationship between Europe and the United States, in my view, needs substantial rethinking. Now, I keep reading that Europeans think we're too dominant and that we need a counterweight, and that Europe therefore has to unify in order to be a counterweight to the United States and balance the United States internationally. And that therefore there's some merit in opposing the United States just for the exercise of it, to learn the practice for the time when Europe gets even stronger. I think this would be a disaster for both sides of the Atlantic. Europe, if it unifies, or when it unifies, will, by necessity, represent a major factor in world affairs. It cannot be ignored, but it doesn't have to unify primarily for that purpose. In fact, if you ask yourself, if you look ahead in the future, what are the challenges we face? If this were an American audience, I would say America has to conduct policies of a different nature in different parts of the world. And since I still believe that our destinies are linked, I would say the same is true of Europe. And let me put it what I would say to an American audience, and now say to an Italian audience. Americans tend to believe that the world can be made peaceful by applying Wilsonian principles. If everybody were democratic, there would be no conflict. And therefore, if we spread our ideas around the world, peace is more or less guaranteed. Now, many in this room and any historian knows that the evolution of democracy is a very complicated process. That took hundreds of years in Europe and probably cannot be force-fed. But in any event, foreign policy has to be conducted in the world as it exists. And there, I would say, there are 3 or 4 different worlds that exist today. There's first of all the North Atlantic region. In that region, in fact, the dominance of democratic principles and democratic traditions ought to be a unifying factor. In that part of the world, it is inconceivable that disputes will be settled by war. Now, of course, we could begin to split and then consume our energies, but it's a basic principle, I would assert this is true. And in the North Atlantic world, then the question is, how can one bring Russia into this world as an immediate challenge? But when you look at Asia, you see a Europe more like the 19th century world. There, the relations between the various states are more similar to the relations of European states prior to World War I. They do not exclude military conflict with each other. They treat India and China, Japan and other parts, treat each other as strategic rivals. And therefore, in dealing with that world, some of the principles of balance of power that one learned in Europe are applicable. And if you go to the Middle East, you're in a 17th century world, a world in which ideology, religion, ethnicity transcend ideas of national interest. And so, and Africa is a totally new problem, because there the issue is how to create political entities out of colonial traditions where no political entities of that kind previously existed. Each of these topics, of course, is capable of long discussion. The main point I would like to make is that on the relations with the rest of the world, with Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, there is no reason why the United States and Europe should be in conflict with each other. We Americans, of course, have to conduct the foreign policy we think is appropriate. But no American can believe that we alone can manage the whole world. The President was kind enough to point out some of my views about peace in the world. And fundamentally, I believe that the world can not be peaceful unless most of the significant participants in the international system believe in its justice. But it can also not be peaceful if there is not enough strength on the part of those who hold common values to defend these values. So it is not a choice, in my view, between values and power, as is always said, but between combining values and power in such a way that those who challenge can be resisted, and those who can be convinced can be brought along. So I am too old now to change my views about the importance of a European-American relationship. And I have seen too much in countries like this to believe that we need to quarrel fundamentally about the issues of the day. Of course, we will differ on some practical problems. But it is important to understand that the traditions which I exemplified by President Truman of a different party than the one I belong to is fundamentally what changed generations of Americans continue to believe. Now, some of you may have heard me use a Chinese proverb or an alleged Chinese proverb that a friend of mine gave me to me once, which I think represents the challenge of the moment. And it says this: when there is turmoil under the heavens, little problems are dealt with as if they were big problems, and big problems are not dealt with at all. When there is order under the heavens, big problems are reduced to little problems, and little problems should not overwhelm us. At this moment, the real issue between America and Europe is, can we distinguish little problems from big problems? And can we reduce big problems to little problems? And if we continue to work together, as we have in the last few months, on the immediate issue, I'm confident that we can do it. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to this distinguished group and to have so many of my friends here in a position where they can't answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kissinger. Avevo dimenticato di dire che il dottor Kissinger desidererebbe avere qualche domanda alla fine del suo intervento. L'intervento è concluso, ma prima di lasciarci sarebbe desiderabile e da lui auspicato che qualcuno potesse sollevare qualche questione. Non lo fa il Presidente ovviamente, ma prego chiunque desideri, sarebbe molto gradito. Il senatore Diri, prego. Yes.
Dr. Kissinger, you said quite rightly that citing President Truman, that the relationship after the war has been built on principles of respect and equality and consultation. And certainly we cannot conceive of any major fundamental difference or conflict that might come up between our nations and continents. Now, in relation to these tendencies towards unilateralism, which you made reference, during our recent trip to the United States as members of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, we certainly got a very clear message from the U.S. administration, and that is, after September 11, the American government reserved itself the right not to intervene militarily in any area of the world when its own security might be established. Now, of course, this would be done probably through the process of consultation. But no mention was made at all of the United Nations. role that is the only body that can provide legitimacy to international law? This is my first question. The second, if I may, relates to the nuclear posture review in this paper that has been linked to the Los Angeles Times a few days ago. Do you think, Dr. Kissinger, that if that involves the abandonment of the comprehensive test ban treaty or the non-proliferation treaty, is to say the spreading again of nuclear weapons, that will increase the security of the world, of the US and of the world? How do you see this?
It's a very good question, and let me first deal with the second question, because the question is, does that nuclear posture review indicate a fundamental change in American strategy, which would involve abandonment of the test ban? Well, of course, the American Senate rejected the test ban treaty in the Clinton administration. So we are not bound by it legally, but we have announced, or the previous administration announced, that we would adhere to it. And I have not heard anyone in this administration indicating any change in that policy. But as I said, the ambassador and his deputy are in a better position to answer that. But I have not heard in several consultations I've had in Washington any change in this. Secondly, I don't exactly know what this paper represents, at what level of the government, and how high it has been approved. When I saw it, my interpretation is as follows. We have always said that if weapons of mass destruction are used against us, we may respond with nuclear weapons, even if they were not nuclear weapons, the weapons of mass destruction. In fact, if they are biological weapons, we are obliged to use something other than biological weapons, because we have renounced the use of biological weapons, even in retaliation. So, as I interpreted that document, it was that if we have to use nuclear weapons, we would prefer to use smaller and more discriminating nuclear weapons. And that's how I interpreted it. Now, there's also, I've read that they're looking for weapons that can go into deep bunkers and so forth, but I relate all of this to the weapons of mass destruction syndrome. I do not believe it is a fundamental change of American strategy, and I have been enough in Washington to would have heard something if it represented a fundamental change in American strategy. So this is making a great drama out of something that I think is essentially inconsequential from the point of view of overall strategy. First question on unilateralism. It is, of course, a problem. To what degree you are bound by consultations. As a general statement, to say that when your national security is involved, that you will act even reluctantly, even if allies disagree, is, I would say, a normal position for a government to take. You cannot permit a country to veto your survival. The question is, how do you define national security? And I believe this probably requires some discussion. I personally think that among the so-called axis of evil countries that were mentioned, there is an urgency about Iraq, and there is a greater scope for consultation, and with respect to the other two, Iran and North Korea. And then there is an additional category of problems which the President didn't specifically mention, which is countries that do not yet have weapons of mass destruction and might develop it. How can you get an international system that assures the world of these weapons going to 10 other countries? And that, of course, cannot be done by the United States alone at all. So there are various levels of multilateralism and some limiting conditions of unilateralism. And it's in that context that I believe the debate should be carried on.
How do you see the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and what are the prospects?
It always goes one question too many. How do I see the Israeli-Palestinian question? I'll just make a general observation, because otherwise one would get into an endless detail. The view I hear most frequently in Europe, and sometimes in the United States, is this: there is some magic formula by which that problem could be made to disappear, after which the Palestinians and Israelis will live with a consciousness of harmony, and the Islamic world will not be angry at the West anymore. And the United States should impose this on Israel. I mean, there's nobody else on whom to impose it. And this is usually described as the 67 borders and some other things. I do not believe that it is possible to go from where we are to a final settlement in one negotiation, to go from mutual extermination to ultimate reconciliation in one negotiation. It's impossible, in my view. And therefore, I believe that any effort to do it that way will lead to the same result as Camp David, and it will explode again. And therefore, I think the more realistic approach would be to find some interim agreement that, in the course of which a Palestinian state would be created, some secure borders are established, some principles of coexistence are devised, and to permit normal economic life to resume. And then look at such issues as refugees and holy places. 5 or 10 years from now, when the atmosphere has improved. Now you can say, nobody will ever accept this. Well, if they'll never accept it, it means they're determined on extermination or on destroying the state. And what I have said seems to me what is conceivable. What I do not believe is possible is to go in one jump to borders that have heretofore been considered insecure, include the refugee question. And I think that this is an issue, if we and the Europeans were to agree and to say to the Israelis, there has to be a peace plan, and to the Arabs, you cannot get all you're asking for, then we'd have a basis for something happening. And this, well, at any rate, this in philosophical outline, so conceptual outline is what I think about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Should we take one more or one more?
One more question. Very last one.
He's got one back here.
Yes. Mr. Kissinger, I particularly appreciate your remark on the new situation of relation between Europe and America. I think it's very perceptive of you, and I think there is not enough awareness of this on both sides. About this, I have a practical question. Italy is not maybe on the forefront of the military effort on terrorism, but certainly is on the forefront of the effect of this terrorism. As you know, we are experiencing now a new wave of immigration, illegal immigration. There will be more of it. I think that maybe the international community should help Italy on something that is really, in reality, a world effort.
Well, I don't know enough about the details, but in every European country there is a debate about immigration that I know, and therefore a common European policy would seem to me to make sense. What role the United States can play in immigration policy into Europe, I think I would question. But it's a subject, I haven't seen what the various choices are. I agree with you, it is an important problem for the future of Europe, just because you're an old friend. And then we'll end.
Yes, Dr. Kissinger, sometime ago you asked yourself, if I have to call Europe, what number do I dial? Now, from what you said this evening, you don't give the idea that this moment is approaching, is it?
You know, one of my destinies is that almost every smart alecky remark that's ever been made is ascribed to me. And I don't remember ever having made that remark, but I'm happy. I'm happy to take credit for it because it was true in that period. Do we know now what number to dial? Well, if you look at the aftermath on September 11th, in the 2 months after September 11th, more national foreign ministers and prime ministers showed up in Washington than the European community. And in a crisis, the Europeans seem to rely more on their national institutions. And one problem is because on the one hand, the world has been globalized economically, but it has not yet been globalized politically to a similar extent. From an American point of view, there's no reason why we should not welcome having a telephone number to call. And I think it is slowly evolving in that direction. But I would like to call your attention from somebody who has practiced this, who has had to practice it, of one peculiarity of the European Union as it applies to dealing with America. When we deal with Italy, we can deal with many levels of the Italian government. And we don't have to bother the prime minister or foreign minister with every issue. There are many levels of consultation by which we can bring our thinking closer together. When we deal with Europe institutionally, there is no European position until the Council of Ministers have met. And once the Council of Ministers have met, there's no point talking because they can't change it except by going through the whole process that disgorged the decision in the first place. And so there is an institutional rigidity. And I think it isn't so much a question of getting one phone number, it's getting a system of consultation where one is not faced with accomplished facts, and where one can have a dialogue in the process of formation. But I hope that the constitution that is being worked on by Giscard d'Estaing and Mr. Amato will help solve this problem.
Dr. Kissinger, you know that we Europeans, we impose on you, actually, I'm sorry.
Excuse me.
We impose on you one more question, but we tend to believe that you will be kind enough to accept it. We Europeans tend to believe that the peace which we have achieved in our generation was due to one or two basic factors. One definitely was keeping the balance of power. NATO saw to that. The other one was the building of institutions. Institution building from Monet onwards was our sort of polar star. It's not perfect, it's not complete, as you have just mentioned, and yet we believe and tend to think that maybe global peace may be achieved through the same two factors. One, keeping the balance of power. Two, building up those imperfect global institutions whose construction began with our generation, with American input of ideas and idealism and European idealism. Do you think that the building of institutions is still a feasible way to peace, to world peace, or do you think, as we tend to believe, that you have always thought that keeping the balance of power is more urgent and more basic?
This reminds me that I didn't really answer Senator Dinni's question about United Nations. I think it's true that in the American public right now, there is not the belief in the United Nations that existed originally, partly because during the Cold War and sometimes afterwards, the dominant role that some of the non-aligned groups played that seemed to be very much directed against the United States, at least to the public. This is a fact which you correctly noted. Now, this relates to your question. Can you build the world entirely on a balance of power? No, because the calculations of balance of power get too complicated. Even with traditional power, as I wrote when I wrote about Bismarck, and with the changing in the technology, and with the changes in ideology in which you now have terrorism which is non-calculable, balance of power by itself will not do. So I believe a number of institutions should be created. For example, on that issue of non-proliferation that I mentioned. But it will be a gradual. It will be a gradual process. And on the globalization issue, there are a whole set of problems where the economic world and the political world are not in harmony with each other. And that needs to be brought into a more institutional framework. So I'm not saying the balance of power is enough, but without it, you can't do the other.
Dr. Kissinger, you probably know that the Dutch physicist Niels Bohr was probably one of the most eminent physicists in the 20th century, used to destroy his colleagues just by saying, very interesting speech. So that's the reason why I'm thanking you for your very intriguing speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Letta, Nancy, I'd like you to meet Mr. Letta. It's the chief of staff of Senator
Alle ore 20 in punto cominciamo a Palazzo Giustiniani.
Very nice to see you.
Grazie. Grazie a voi. Grazie, ciao.
Lapo and I are going.
This made the same job for engineering.